The Middle East. الشرق الأوسط. המזרח התיכון. חבר מיונה. אורתודוקס. If the Middle East is a microcosm of all the world's problems, Lebanon is a microcosm of all the Middle East's problems. This is the last program in our series about the Middle East, and we're going to devote most of it to Lebanon, because it's in Lebanon that so many of the conflicts and tensions that bedevil the whole region are now coming to a head. If there's one word that sums up all these problems, it's identity. The Middle Easterners are torn between East and West, between tradition and change, between religion and secularism. And within their religions, there are many sectarian divisions, just as within their societies, there are numerous ethnic and tribal divisions. When you superimpose nationalism on top of all this, and expect all these conflicting identities to resolve themselves into one homogeneous national identity, no wonder there's trouble. And no wonder there's more trouble in Lebanon than perhaps any other Middle Eastern country. Since Lebanon is such an incredibly complex tangle of different religious, ethnic, and tribal groups, Lebanon is bounded on the south by Israel and on the north and east by Syria. The total population of Lebanon is about 3.5 million people. Of these, roughly 2 million are Muslims and 1.5 million are Christians. The Muslims consist of 1 million Shias, 600,000 Sunnis, and 350,000 Druze. The main Christian groups are made up of about 600,000 Maronites, 300,000 Greek Orthodox, and 250,000 Armenians. Now we'll hear from an expert from Lebanon what he feels are the main events that have shaped that country over the last 40-odd years. Dr. Abdulatif Harris.
The National Pact of 1943 was very important because it was the first document on which the Lebanese agreed actually to share a country together. Before 1943, the Christians and the Muslims, the Muslims did not want it to be a part of Lebanon. They actually felt that they were part of the Arab world and mostly of Syria. And what they wanted to be is just a part of Syria. And the Christians at the same time, they wanted a homeland, a Christian's homeland of their own, but feeling that their country in their own land, especially in the mountain, is not economically viable without the coastal cities of Beirut, Tripoli, Sidon, and the fertile lands of the Bekaa Valley. And that's why there was necessary for these two major religious groups to come together to reach an agreement. And that agreement have actually reflected the pluralistic nature of the Lebanese society. In general, this agreement have just, on one hand, satisfied the Muslim by claiming the Arab character of Lebanon on one side, and on the other side, it satisfied also the Christians by also recognizing the Western side of the Lebanese culture. The next important event was the revolution of this war, the Civil War of 1958. During this period, even though Lebanon was economically a prosperous country, it seems that the Lebanese president have just neglected some aspects of the National Pact and have agreed on some foreign policy in which the Muslims of the country have just disagreed. And among this policy, it was the fact that Lebanon did not break diplomatic relationship with England and France in 1956 after Israel, England, and France attacked Egypt. And at that time, most Arab countries did break diplomatic relations with France and England. and Lebanon refused to do so. And also the president of Lebanon at that time, Kamil Shamoun, from 1952 to 1958, accepted the Eisenhower Doctrine, which most Arab countries rejected at that time. And this angered the Muslim of the country, and they felt that the country was more and more neglecting one of the most important aspects of the political nature of the Lebanese state. And then after 1958, I think from 1958 to 1964, Lebanon witnessed one of its most important periods. Fuad Shihab, the Lebanese president at that period, from 1958 to 1964, was one of the most important figures in Lebanon's political life. He was able for the first time to introduce some sort of political and social reform. And this reform, which is called the Shihab's reform, have for the first time united the Lebanese together. And loyalty of the Lebanese at that period has shifted from loyalty to their own sect to loyalty to the Lebanese state. And he was able to do this by introducing some kind of administrative reform and by considering qualification as the basis of employment. And this was not the case before Fuad Shihab or before this period, and even not after this period. And also Shihab was able to introduce some kind of agricultural reform, and he created the Green Project in which millions of Lebanese pounds were spent on land reclamation and cultivations, and many projects for irrigations were established at that period. However, this period, despite the fact that Lebanon have enjoyed some kind of stability and national unity, there was some controversy about his presidency. The Christians felt that it's too much concession which were giving to the Muslims at the expense of the Christian prerogatives. They felt that because most of the areas which benefited from this reform were mostly Muslim areas. So they felt that for a long time that most of the taxes, like 80% of the taxes in the country are paid by the Christians, and therefore they should get most of the government spendings. So they believe that people who pays more should get more. And after this, actually, I would say that by the end of 1964, Shihab himself have felt that his reform is not going to last. And he actually, in 1970, he refused to be elected again as president of Lebanon. And he said he doesn't believe that there is a way of reforming the political system in Lebanon. Or he felt actually that the Lebanese politicians are not ready to accept a reform which will put Lebanon on the road toward modernization and social justice. So the civil war of 1974-75 has been predicted since then. Many people felt that Lebanon's political and social system is declining, and they were waiting for the moment when everything was going to explode. And because of the endless war which has started in 1975, many aspects of the Lebanese society is being transferred and changed. In today's Lebanon, while the Sunnis of Lebanon still identify themselves with the Arabs, the Shiites have more and more identified themselves now with the Iranians. And actually most of the Shiites of the south have some Persian roots. So they are reviving their roots in that period. And that's how even the differences between Sunnis and Shiite has some kind of ethnic background. And the conflict between Iran and Iraq and the Arab world has also affected the politics of Lebanon. While the Sunnis of Lebanon are sympathetic with the Sunnis, with the Sunni of Iraq, we see that the Shiite are sympathetic with Iran, and that's how their attitude toward the Arabs has been changed since the Iran-Iraq war. And feeling that they are more powerful now, they were able to dissociate themselves from the Arabs and to establish their own identity as Shiites on one hand and also as some ethnic group which is different from the Arabs. And that's what actually also the Maronites have been trying to do since a long time ago. And it's one of the important issues in Lebanon's politics, because the Maronites claim that they are not Arabs and they are Phoenicians, or some of them believe they have some French roots, and some others believe maybe they are Mediterraneans. But they all agree on one fact, that they are not Arabs, and they identify themselves with the Phoenicians, despite the fact that the Maronites moved to Lebanon in the 7th century from Syria. And they were always mountain dwellers, where the Phoenicians were city dwellers. The Phoenicians used to live in Beirut, Tripoli, Sidon. They have never lived in the mountains. And if this was one of the controversial points among the Muslims and the Christians, now it's one of the controversial points also among the Sunnis and the Shiites. So the identity of Lebanon as being perceived by the Lebanese, it has created some problems before, but these problems are getting more and more complex, which make everything actually clear at the same time, because Lebanon is a pluralistic society, and the Lebanese have to realize that without freedom and without realization or recognition of this pluralistic aspect of the society, Lebanon cannot survive.
Lebanon presents probably the most complex of all Middle Eastern problems. But there's no denying that the whole region is very complicated. Not only that, but as we've tried to show in this series, many aspects of the Middle Eastern way of life are very different from what we're used to in the West. In North America in particular, we have to make a huge effort to wrench ourselves away from our normal way of thinking in order to understand the Middle Easterners, because they have been molded by a history that is very different from ours. To start with, it's a very much longer history. Our North American society has only been in existence for about 300 years. And even European civilization has only been around for about 2,000 years or so. Whereas Middle Eastern civilization dates back well over 7,000 years. In all this time, it's hardly surprising that Middle Eastern society has grown intricate and convoluted, symbolized so graphically by that most ubiquitous of all Middle Eastern images, the arabesque, which weaves itself into 1,001 different forms almost everywhere you look. We've only been able to highlight some of the major patterns in this intricate design. The all-pervasive nature of religion in the Middle East, the importance of the family and its effect on women in particular, authoritarian traditions of government, sectarian differences within the major religions, and so on. Where do we go from here? A Western diplomat who specialized in the Middle East once said if he'd predicted in 1970 that by 1980 oil prices would multiply 11 times, a religious revolution would topple the Shah, and Egypt would sign a peace treaty with Israel, his government would have fired him as a lunatic. So we won't make any predictions. But we can point to some interesting trends. First of all, as in most of the Third World, there is a population explosion in the Middle East. In 1930, there were about 80 million people in the Middle East. Today, there are over 230 million, and most of these people are ending up in the cities. The most distressing example of this is Cairo, whose population increases by 250,000 people every year. Because of the rapid population growth, most Middle Easterners are very young. Over 1/2 of them are under 18 years old. These young people are the future of the Middle East. In what direction will they go? What sort of identity will they have? Well, if we look again at the 4 major peoples of the Middle East, we see that 3 of these peoples do now at least have a single territorial identity. Most Turks live in one country, Turkey. The Iranians live in Iran. And the overwhelming majority of Jews in the Middle East live in Israel. But the Arabs are split up among a score of different countries. Why don't the Arabs just form themselves into one large Arab state? Well, they've tried to on numerous occasions. The Ba'ath Party in Syria and Iraq was founded for that very purpose over 40 years ago. But the Ba'athist attempts at Arab unity have never met with much success. Gamal Abdel Nasser also championed Pan-Arabism when he established the United Arab Republic in 1958. But that arrangement fell apart a few years later, as has every other attempt at the unification of the Arab world. This accounts for one of the strangest aspects of the Arab-Israeli conflict. There is tiny Israel, surrounded by a score of Arab countries, and outnumbered nearly 50-to-1 by the Arabs. And yet, most of the battles fought between Israel and the Arab states have been won by Israel, mainly because the Arabs have not been united. Why is it so difficult for the Arabs to get together? One reason is because the populations of various Arab states are strung out over such a vast area. They're like an archipelago of little islands in a huge desert sea. And there are large economic discrepancies between the way people live in these islands. Some have become very rich from oil, others are still very poor. Some are very modern, others are very traditional. And most of the Arab countries are fragmented into religious and ethnic divisions, not only Sunnis and Shi'is and Maronites and Copts, but also large groups of non-Arabs as well, such as the Berbers in North Africa or the Kurds in Iraq. So any attempt at a nice, clear-cut Arab identity is muddied by dozens of other sub-identities. Whether the Arabs will ever succeed in uniting into one country is an open question. But one thing is certain. In general, all across the Middle East, religious identities are becoming stronger and stronger. This is most noticeable in the case of Islam. But it also applies to Christianity and Judaism. But since 95% of the Middle Easterners are Muslims, it is Islam that has the greatest impact. And it is the young Muslims, not the old, who are returning to the fundamentals of their religion and taking all the injunctions in the Quran literally, whether they refer to very personal things, such as the need for a man to grow a beard, or for a woman to cover up every part of her body except her hands and face, or to more general matters, such as the Islamic banking system, which precludes the lending of money at interest, or to Islamic law, which prohibits alcohol and gambling. Why this religious revival? It's part of a general reaction against the West. Politically, all the Middle Eastern countries are now independent of the Western world. And yet they are still culturally dependent. They're still being swamped by Western products, and values and lifestyles. Of course, this is part of a global trend toward a common material culture. People on a beach in Israel look very much like beachgoers in Florida. A discotheque in Istanbul might just as well be in Manhattan. But many young Middle Easterners are now rebelling against all this. They're trying to buck this trend toward global uniformity by demanding cultural independence. And the most powerful alternative to Western culture that they can find is Islamic culture. How far will this swing back to fundamental Islam go? Again, it's difficult to say, because there are such powerful forces pulling in the opposite direction. Apart from anything else, the economies of most Middle Eastern countries are inextricably tied to the economies of Europe, Japan, and the United States. Even though Iranian mobs may chant, "Na Sharqi, na Gharbi," no East, no West, Iranian oil and gas are still sold to the highest bidder, wherever he comes from. And finally, of course, simply to survive in today's world, the Middle East must continue to modernize and to invest in the latest technology. But is it possible to modernize without Westernizing? Can you take the machines and the techniques of the West and leave the ideas and values behind? Can you combine a modern identity with an Islamic identity? For many Middle Easterners, the answer is yes. Whether they're right or not remains to be seen. But how will all these things affect what is going on in the major Middle East trouble spots? The borders of Israel, Lebanon, Iran and Iraq, the Gulf. When a medieval Muslim writer came to the end of a series of speculations about the world, he would often write, "And God knows better." Since events in the Middle East have such a disturbing tendency to overturn all predictions, perhaps we too should end on that humble note. Allahu A'lam.